Okay, I'm going to talk something about names because of Parashat Shmos. Some fine gentlemen pointed out that I may have spoken about this last year. In which case, there'll be a fahar afterwards, and you'll tell me what I said last year, what I said different this year. Yeah, we'll see. In any case, there's a vakanta medrash in the beginning of this week's parsha that says B'shvil daled dvarim niglu aviseinu Mitzrayim. There are 4 reasons why Klal Yisrael was redeemed from Mitzrayim. 4 like schusim that they did, things that they didn't change. The famous one is Shalishinu es Malbusham. They didn't change their modality of dress. Shalishinu es Shemam. They didn't change their names. And then the other 2 are Shalei Dibru Lashon Hara and Shalei Prutzim Ba'arayis. They didn't talk Lashon Hara and they weren't, parrots and arayas. Now the one of Shalishinu es Lashonim, they didn't change their language. That one is not actually in this medrash. It's a little bit sketchier where that comes from. That's the whole Yiddish discussion and whatever, but we're going to leave that aside for now. In any case, one of the clear schusim that Klal Yisrael brought to beer, so to speak, and was a reason they were able to get out of Mitzrayim was that they didn't change their names. So, what exactly is a Yiddish name? What makes a name so important? What makes a name special? What is or isn't a good reason for a name? What are names that are worth naming after? Who's the right to name? All these are things worth discussing, and I think we'll turn this into a bit of a series, and we'll discuss some of these things in detail. But for now, I think the one that's most appropriate to start with for Parashat Shmos is the shaila, the sugya of Jewish names versus non-Jewish names. Meaning, everyone has a Jewish name, they get called up to the Torah, they got it at their bris. Most people, in America for sure, have another name that they go by. Some people have it on their birth certificate, some people don't have it on their birth certificate. Depends how, worried about anti-Semitism their parents were. LinkedIn. The LinkedIn, the business name, right? Everyone's got a different name. Now some of them are really just like cheap variations of the name itself, like Moshe turns into Mo, that's an easy one. But like I'm talking about the more elaborate ones, the Brads and the Stevens and all the more elaborate English names. And the halachic, sugya that's about it, and the back and forth. Now, there's an interesting tshuva from the Maharam Schick that I really want to start with. I really have a very interesting story that I want to tell you, but we have to come through the root of the Maharam Schick before we discuss it. Now, really there's so much to get to names. Let's go this route through the Maharam Schick and through this story, and then we'll see what we get back to. There's a Maharam Schick. It's a tshuva in Yeridea in Yeridea in Simon Samach Tes. The Maharam Schick has a very, very ardent position, a strong position. The shaila is as follows. He says, Im Amnam, he says, She'enani Yedea. One second. Here. Sheyesh b'nei Adam shemachinam atzmim b'shem hagayim. You asked me about people who give themselves names of Gayish names. Umalasini riyor v'chiachas haisam. You gave them Musar. The Hari Amru b'medrash b'schus zeh shleishinu hashmam zachinu latzis mitzrayim. You gave them Musar because you told them the medrash says that because of people not changing their names is why Klal Yisrael got out of Mitzrayim. V'hein meshivim, and they answered you. Shelazed dai b'mashiyesh lam shem Yehudi l'kroisim b'lalas l'Torah. They said it's enough that we have a Jewish name, that we get called up to the Torah. We have a Jewish name that we got at our birth. You don't have to always be called by a Jewish name. Nothing wrong with being called by a not Jewish name. You have to also have a Jewish name. That's what they answered you. And you told them that that's not true. And you said, Tzchukas Hagoy, and Kadoshim Tiyu, and V'Avdul Aschem and Amim. You have to be separate, you have to have a Jewish name. And this is the dispute that you presented to me. This is what the Maharam Schick shaila is. So it says the Maharam Schick as follows. He says, it's Pashat that you're right, he says. U'b'yoser b'yer amarti, that you're right. He brings a raya, and then he says as follows. There's a Taisvis, and the Maharam Schick hangs his hat on this. He brings a Taisvis in Gittin. Kasav Taisvis b'Gittin, the Flam Daladam Beis b'Shem Rabbeinu Tam, shechas v'shalom lahaskir shem nachri v'get. Rabbeinu Tam says chas v'shalom to put a Goyish name, a name of a Goy into a get, into the language of a get. He says you see that Rabbeinu Tam held that it was like chukas hagoy. It's very aser, and you can't bring these names. You can't go by these names. V'afilu b'get. Even in a get, where if anyone's seen a get, you write all of the mysteries, right? A get is like, his name is Moshe, the mystery, whatever, the mystery. You get every iteration of the name, but if his, business, his company is registered under Muhammad, you don't put that name into the get, right? You don't, that version you don't put in. It says, in a time you see is so machmer, that even a place where you really put every single variation of the name, you don't put any names over there. Then it says, fine, etc. That's the drive from Rabbeinu Tam. Now this is Maharam Schick, and the Maharam Schick really bases most of the tshuva on the Midrashim and the Sifri in this week's parsha, that say that Goyish names was like a big no-no for Klal Yisrael, and that's what they were able to get out, and which is strange, because generally we don't bayos halacha from Midrashim, from like a Medrash says like a bunch of schusim that Klal Yisrael had. That's not something to bayos a halacha from, and in Befrat, it's not a din in Shulchan Aruch that says from this medrash, don't give a Goyish name. So he's really building on very shaky ground. And then he brings what he considers to be like a real good raya. He says, Ayin Taisis and Gittin Lamadal days. Rabbeinu Tam says that even in a get, where we always write the surnames, the co-names, all the various, iterations of the name, you leave it out over here. You don't put the Goyish name. This is what he says.
You're saying halacha?
Now,
You're saying what you should do.
No. He's saying halacha. It's a tshuva. It's a halacha l'maisa. This is what he's saying. And he says his name, Kaidua, the name Schick, Shin Yud Kof, is an acronym for Shem Yisrael Kodesh. He says, when my great-grandparents had to choose an English surname, a Goyish surname, when the Austrian government made them do it, they cleverly chose Schick, which is Shem Yisrael Kodesh. They never even gave up on their Hebrew name. This is the Maharam Schick's famous tshuva. What do you say?
Before Moshe's Beverly, the whole discussion on Moshe.
This is for sure before Moshe. I'm saying Maharam Schick is. We'll see. Rav Moshe has a tshuva about the Maharam Schick Lahadya. No, he has a tshuva on this exact Maharam Schick. No, even short. No, indirect. No diukim. So this is the Maharam Schick's tshuva. Now, what's interesting is that if you look in Taisis and Gittin, and I want to show you Taisis and Gittin, it's hard to understand. It's hard to understand what's going on. Well, really, the way to ask it is as follows. If you look, and Rav Moshe is going to bring all these rayas, if you look throughout Shas, you'll see tons of Amiroim who had non-Jewish names. Tons of Rishonim who had non-Jewish names. For example, I'll give you a small list. Taisvis, there's a Mandamar Taisis called the Reino Peter. He's brought down in Taisis and Gittin, no less. A few blocks before Ben Atam. Peter is Peter. That's a Goyish name. He was a contemporary of Ben Atam. There's the Ramah's father's name was Rav Tudris, not a Jewish name. Vidal ibn Talush is the Maggid Mishnah. Vidal is a Latin name. It means life. It means vital, vitality. It's all the same word. It's English for life. It's Latin for life. What do you say? Rav Chaim Vital? Very likely. Yeah, very likely. That's one of the rayas as to where Rav Chaim Vital, if he was Ashkenazi or Sephardi, Makari, where do you pick up that name from? It's an Italian name. More than likely Rav Chaim Vital came from Italian. Yeah, if you have Ha'aris, you send them here. He has all these. Then there's, if you look in the Yerushalmi, the Bavli, there's Amiroim who had Rav Avidrumos, Rav Petriki, Rav Chia Bar Titos, Rav Yudah Bar Titos. There's so many different Amiroim and Chachmei Yisrael throughout the Deiros who had clearly not Jewish names. So Rav Moshe very validly makes this point, and he says clearly this was not the halacha psuka. This wasn't what the halacha was. Meaning everyone was doing names of all sorts of various Goyish names that made it into the regular, Jewish name circuit. So what's going on? So what's the story with Maharam Schick? So let's take a look at this Taisvis, and it's an interesting Taisvis, and then I want to explain it, I think, in a creative way and maybe validate this Maharam Schick in like a shtickle backhanded way. Taisvis in Gittin Lamdal Bey says as follows. It says Shaul Lula Rabbeinu Tam. Now this is interesting. Rabbeinu Tam and Taisvis usually. Everyone's seen Taisis. Taisis is usually Minei in the Sugyas or from another Sugya. It's a Kasha from a Sugya where Taisis says something, right? This is not a regular Taisis. This is a Taisis that's obviously paraphrasing a tshuva that Rabbeinu Tam had. Shaul Rabbeinu Tam is Lashon of a tshuva, like in Sefer HaYashar. Shaul Rabbeinu Tam, they asked Rabbeinu Tam a Shaila. Al Mumr Lavedis Kechavim. About a Mumr Lavedis Kechavim, an apostate who became a Catholic probably. Shagirish Ishta, he gave his wife a get. V'lei nichtav beget al Hashem shel Yehudis. When he gave the get, they only wrote his Jewish name in there. They didn't write any of his new Goyish name. Chas v'shalom to be masker this Goyish name b'teres Moshe Yisrael in the get. Now, clearly, if you look at Taisvis, this is not the way the Maharam Schick is presenting it. This is not a straight up sack from Taisvis that a Goyish name doesn't belong in a get because Goyish names are not allowed. The Shaila was a very different Shaila. The Shaila that was asked Rabbeinu Tam was about a mummer who became a Catholic and was divorcing his wife and was using a get, and they didn't include. What do you say?
Who thinks he became a Catholic?
Who thinks he became a Catholic, exactly. And the Shaila was to include his Catholic name, so to speak, as Maharam Schick is saying, to dignify his new Catholic identity and include that in the get. And Tom says, no, chas v'shalom, that whole sprach, chas v'shalom, tells you something's going on over it that's not regular. Meaning, Taisvis is pulling a tshuva that Rabbeinu Tam wrote about a specific circumstance, about a mummer who converted, and the Shaila was to dignify his Catholicism or not to dignify his Catholicism. And Rabbeinu Tam says, chas v'shalom, don't dignify his Catholicism that he became a convert. Ignore it, don't put that in the get. Now, so seemingly like the Maharam Schick is bringing a Taisvis that really has nothing to do with the Shaila that's being discussed. He's ultimately just relying on the Midrashim from this week's parasha. And Ramesh is bringing tremendous amount of precedents from all various, sugyas throughout Bavli and Yerushalmi, as well as Bali Taisvis and etc. That English name, that Goyish names, was a very common and prevalent, thing that happened. So I want to explain Rabbeinu Tam's posture over here a little bit with the Mumrim, and I think it helps us understand the Maharam Schick, and that's as follows. I want to start with a different story that happened 300-400 years after Rabbeinu Tam, and use this to shed some light on Rabbeinu Tam's own tshuva, and that's as follows. And this I don't know. This part I don't think I said. There's a story that happened in Buda. Buda is Budapest. It was originally two different cities on two sides of the river, Buda and Pest. This is a city story that happened in Buda in the 1550s, more give or take, in the 1550s. There was a person, his name was Schneier. It seems his Yiddish name was Ittel, like Aleph Yud Tes Lamed, Ittel Schneier. How to spell that in a get might be complicated, Taka. Ittel with an I and Ittel with an Aleph, I don't know, but Ittel Schneier was his name. He was he was a successful person. He was from the upstanding people in the Kehillah in Buda at the time. Now, it's interesting is that Budapest, Hungarians, I don't know if you noticed this, Hungarians sometimes could be dark. Like it have a certain darkness. Budapest used to be part of the Ottoman Empire, part of the Turks. So there's a lot of Sephardic genetics, like in Hungary. A lot of these old Hungarian cities that became later on major Hungarian, even like Hasidic bastions, whatever, have like a certain amount of Sephardic heritage. And if you look at old chuvas from like the 1700s, there's a lot of fighting about the minhag HaKehillah. Should it be Sephardic minhagim? Should it be Ashkenazic minhagim? Because the cities, a lot of the main cities in Hungary were controlled by the Ottoman Empire for hundreds of years, from like 1541 until I don't remember exactly what year it is, to what year they lost it, but it's a long time, like a few hundred years that the Ottomans controlled it. Now this is during Ottoman Buda. And this Ittel Schneier is an important person in the town. He's a chashuv person. He goes on business to Constantinople, to the seat of power of the Ottoman Empire, and he makes a big mistake. He starts a relationship with a woman there, a not Jewish woman, a woman of high society, a powerful woman. For whatever reason, one thing leads to another, and he makes a mistake. He does something he's not supposed to. Now, what's interesting is this woman's family, who's like a high society woman, a prominent woman, says, it's a bizayon for us that she was with a Jewish man. The only way to fix this is that you need to convert to Islam. It was the Ottomans. You have to convert to Islam. Like that, it's not so embarrassing for us. And like that, she was with a Muslim, big deal. Like you have to convert to Islam. Or if you don't convert to Islam, there'll be severe penalties. I don't know exactly what they threatened him. It's hard to know. There'll be severe penalties. And Ittel Schneier was a middle-aged man. He had adult children. He was a successful person. And he couldn't withstand the Nisayan, and he becomes a Muslim. He converts to Catholicism, to Islam. And the caliph, the sultan of Constantinople, gives him some sort of real power, and there is evidence of him being part of the sultan's court and being a rich person in Constantinople at the time. They pulled him into some sort of orbit of power, and it paid off for him. Now, what's interesting is that there are two tshuvas in Gedolei HaPoskim discussing him and his family in a very interesting context. One's from the Maharam of Padua, an Italian Rav, Ashkenazi Italian Rav, and one is from the Zakan Aaron, Rav Aaron of Izmir. He was the Rav of Izmir in Turkey, Vaita part of the Ottoman Empire. And both of them are handling a very interesting shaila. It seems that at some point, the Chachmei Yisrael, I don't know who's responsible for this, made a knas that if a parent goes off the derech, you don't call the kids up by that parent's name anymore. Lamashal, this Ittel Schneier had adult children. I can tell you their names because in the Tshuva of the Maharam Padua it says their names. It's the brothers of Avram and Ephraim. I don't think they had last names yet then. It's the brothers of Avram and Ephraim, and the shaila is as follows. He says, "Hey Mekila Kadesha Oban." They're in Oban. V'aviyim Zois Lefnim B'Yisrael Ittel Schneier Shmoi. Back in the day, their father's name was Ittel Schneier. V'Himir Dasai. He went off the derech. He became a convert. Ubanav Hayikarim Hanal. His Erlich Avoila children. Like Alu L'Sefer Miyemahu. They haven't gotten an aliyah since then. Ki Yevoishu Lihikari B'Shem Avi Aviyam. The meaning was you'd call them up in the name of the grandfather. You'd say Yamoid Avram ben whatever Ittel Schneier's father's name was. So it was not to dignify Ittel Schneier. You don't want his name to be mentioned in the shul anymore. And the shaila came to the Ram Padva and the Zakan Aaron. Could we refer to them? Is there a way to they're embarrassed. They're upstanding individuals. They're prominent people in the town. They would like to get an aliyah, but they don't want to be tarred and feathered every time they get an aliyah. So he says as follows: V'ata ishtanu l'greyusa v'nishalti im yesh tzad heter she'inekroim al shem aviyim k'mikodim v'hinni l'hairis by heter gemura. And he tells you right away what he's going to do. He telegraphs the answers. I'm going to be makel on this completely and show that it's heter gemura. And then he continues, and it's a little bit of a tshuva, and he explains what exactly Shem Rishayim Yerkov means, when we don't want a Russia's name to be involved, when we do want a Russia's name to be involved. And basically, he says, Shem Shalom Yerkov doesn't require that we should not mention his name in the shul. It just means not to name after him. It doesn't mean to not mention his name in shul. And then he brings something interesting. He says that this person, Ittel Shneir, he says, I've heard from good, I have on good authority that he wasn't such a bad guy. He couldn't withstand the Nisayan, and he became a mummer. He couldn't withstand it, but he wasn't such a bad guy. And I know of many different Jews that he helped in the Sultan's court, and how he benefited lots of Jews. And actually, in the tshuva of this Kanaran, who was Turkish and was probably much more connected to the story, like he was living much more local and knew much more people, over there the details are more direct, exactly who he helped and how he risked his own life to help his fellow Jews and how dangerous it was for him, and etc. So there's a lot even more details there. And both of them come to the same conclusion, that we could be makel and we could allow these children to be called up by their father's name, even though the father was a mummer. Now, what this tshuva highlights, what Ram Patva and this Kanaran highlights, is a very interesting thing. There seemed to have been one of the main reactions to a mummer in the early days, of someone who converted, who went to a different direction, was to blot his name out. You don't dignify him his name. You take his name out of the ledger, out of the books, even his Hebrew name. You take his name out of circulation. Now, I found something interesting. Rabbeinu Tam in Sefer HaYashar writes as follows: Kala Mishumadim, he says, Beina Yehudim, all the Mishumadim between the Yehudim. Now, you have to keep in mind, in the days of Rabbeinu Tam, it was relatively, it would happen. It was something that happened. It wasn't, problem was something that happened. He says, Mechina Maisim Lignai. We refer to them with like a gnai. He says, for example, Yehuda, we call him Yehudach. Avram, Avron. Asher, Asherah. Menachem, Melachem. These are all like plays on the name, where you say something like nasty, you twist the name with some sort of like nasty line about the person so as not to mention his name and like dignify him as such. And then he says, V'kama mishumadim girshun esheseim ve'olam lekasvel Hashem Yehudis v'chein maisim b'chol yom. In this tshuva in Sefer HaYashar, in the full context that Taisus is quoting, this is the full context of the tshuva. The tshuva says, we always look to diminish their names, to not mention their names, to bastardize their names, give a twist, so it should be some sort of bizayin. And there was many gittin that I presided over of a mummer, and I never once included their other name, I only did their Jewish name. So you see clearly in context that Rabbeinu Tam was saying was nothing to do with Jewish names, Goyish names, nothing to do with what Maharam Schick's using it for. Rabbeinu Tam in context is clearly talking about the idea of like sticking it to them with their name. Now we stick it to them with their Hebrew name. You don't say their Hebrew name. You don't give them any derech eretz on the name. You don't put some respect on that name. You don't give them any respect. And then we also don't dignify their Goyish name by putting it in the get. Now, in context, Rabbeinu Tam is saying something very, very different than what the Rav Schick is using him for. And we'll get to Rav Moshe's tshuva, and Rav Moshe is very clear like this. And Rav Moshe is absolutely correct about the core question. I'm not one to say that, but just looking at the evidence of both sides, Rav Moshe is making a very good point. But I think that if you really think about the Rabbeinu Tam in context and the Rav Schick in context, the Rav Schick is actually making a very, very interesting point. I don't know if this is what he means to say, but the Rabbeinu Tam is saying that any time having a secular name is a way of dignifying someone's, going astray, or someone doing something they're not supposed to, then the way we punish it, so to speak, or the way we try to make barriers is by not dignifying the name. Maharam Schick is living in a generation of Haskalah, facing very similar challenges in a certain sense. They're not converting to Catholicism in Maharam Schick's day, but what he's facing is a wave of secularization. Nobody's choosing an English name over there just for convenience. Like people today in business, they just want to have an English name because they work with Goyim, the Goyim don't know how to pronounce their names. Just easier to just have a name that everyone understands that they pronounce. Maharam Schick is writing, during Haskalah when there's a wave of secularity, and it almost is exactly what Rabbeinu Tam is talking about. The idea of saying we're going to blacklist not Jewish names, and we're only going to communicate with your Jewish name, we're not going to accept the not Jewish name that you're providing, is actually very, very much in the spirit of Rabbeinu Tam. It's mamish not what Rabbeinu Tam says, but it's exactly what Rabbeinu Tam meant. So, it's an interesting thing to me that Maharam Schick, he's quoting Rabbeinu Tam, which is out of context, and Rav Moshe says it's out of context. And if you look at the whole truth in Sefer HaYashar, it's even more clearly out of context. And Rav Moshe doesn't even bring the whole truth in Sefer HaYashar. It's even more out of context. But the spirit of what Rabbeinu Tam was trying to do is the same thing that Maharam Schick's doing. So it's like an interesting call to Siyata D'Shmaya, like what he's saying, but lav mitamei. He's bringing a taisvis that's actually very relevant to what he's saying, even if it's not exactly what he's saying. Now, I want to just go to Rav Moshe's tshuva, just the meat and potatoes of it. Rav Moshe has a tshuva as follows. Rav Moshe in Ar Chaim Daled in tshuva Samach Vav, Rav Moshe has a famous tshuva about this, and Rav Moshe says that there's nothing wrong with it. He brings all these rayas, these gemaras that we discussed, and then he deals with the medrash from this week's parsha. He says something interesting. He says, "V'hinei be'etzem hamatzino har b'shem shel amiram shenikru b'shem ha'aramis." We find many Aramic names. Some of them are very, very famous ones. Kagon Rav Papa Rav Zvid, Mar Zutra, Mar Kshisha, Mar Yenuka, Boyd Harbi Mega Einim, Rubam Nikru B'Shem Aramis, Ach Ule Yeshlem the Ramashani, Feinstein the Aramis. Different, but these are the mainstays of Shas of the Gemara, are all names that are in Aram. It says Vini Yeshmakim Leimar. One second, I want to get you the 1 second. He handles the medrash in this week's parasha. He says as follows. 1 second. He says, "Vina yeshmakim leim v'dizesha shibchu Chazal in Vayikra Rav Lamed Beis Begolos Mitzrayim Shleishinu Hashmam." He says you find Chazal or Mishabeach strongly that the Klal Yisrael Mitzrayim didn't change their names. Hu l'koydem matan Torah. He says that's talking about dafka koydem matan Torah. Shaloi hoya heker gadol b'shvil kiyum hamitzvos t'bnei Noach. There was not that much of a difference between Klal Yisrael and the Egyptians that they lived with. Most of the Jews were very assimilated. They did have Avodah Zarah. Most of them didn't give bris milas to their children. Ad samach like Geula, until very close to the Geula. When they needed to eat the Karm Pesach, Shemalos and Yeshua. It sounds like by and large, the largest amount of Klal Yisrael didn't have milas b'chal. Fine. Shalachain b'shvil ha'emunah sheyigalu v'ratzu she'nikarim she'nisrael hinig lahakbit le'yishanu hashmam. Because they were still hoping to one day get out of Galus, they maintained this last hold. They kept on to their name. Moshe says it's a very, very narrowly tailored thing in that generation. That generation, which is like flipping the whole thing on its ear. Everybody thinks of this medrash, like how strongly they kept to themselves, how strong their identity was. And Moshe says it's mamish the opposite. They had no identity left. All they were left with is that they still maintained, like, just give your kids a Jewish name. So it says Moshe, it's more than likely that even in that dar, they had Goyish names also. You gave a name still, even though they weren't giving bris milah and they weren't keeping the Torah and they're being Avodah Zarah. You still gave your kid a Jewish name. Like, we still have some identity. We're still part of the Jewish people, hoping that they'll be still a Geula. Says Moshe, there was a particular schos for Geula, because they were being semich that there's going to be a Geula. They believed the Nevuah, that one day there's going to be a Geula. And because of that, they clung to this like little thing. They gave the name. So like Moshe turns the whole medrash on its head, really. But I mean, it is what it is. Meaning these are, the fact that Klal Yisrael primarily didn't have bris milah was mostly Avodah Zarah is factual. So it is what it is. Moshe just like, it takes this whole medrash and it turns it in like in a whole different direction. Says Moshe, so of course Ladina, it's pashut that for time in memoriam, all the way since Mitzrayim, Jews have been taking names of their host countries. When in Egypt they had Egyptian names, when in Rome, Roman names, Babylonian names, etc., etc. Spain, Germany, v'chulu, and Taka. Many of those names have migrated into the Tanam and Amiraim and Ga'inim and Rishainim and etc. And so even today, less. In some ways we're more insular than we ever were because we have such a large community and we live with each other and whatever. And but a lot of Yiddish names, like for women, like that have no makar. Maybe we'll get to in some later weeks, older Chaim Kanevsky stuff and whatever. But there's a lot of like Yiddish names that have no makaris, that are just local names that migrated into the Jewish, name bank. Like they just made it into the Jewish name bank. But in any case, Rav Moshe it's like a famous shuvah. Rav Moshe strongly argues in this Maharam Schick and says that there's no real source for it. Now, to me, it's just it's a fascinating discussion to see the Maharam Schick, how it's really just, I get a kick out of this Rebbeinu Tam, that he took this Rebbeinu Tam that really is not a makar, but it is kind of a makar, but it just makes the Maharam Schick much more subject to the time and place. Meaning it's not a halacha, like there's a halacha in Shulchan Aruch that says knowing no Goyish names. It really depends. Not having an English name is a tool in the toolbox of fighting against, modernity and haskala and people converting, etc. It's one of the tools in the toolbox. Just like you see in the Tshuva of the Maharam Padua, and you see Rebbeinu Tam used it. It's a tool in the toolbox. Now, I don't know if that's how the Maharam Schick, maybe the minute you say it's a tool in the toolbox, nobody takes you seriously. So you have to say it's usher, and that's how you use the tool. Maybe the Maharam Schick showing you how you use the tool. You say it's usher, that's how you use the tool. I don't know, but it's to me, a very interesting, very interesting little ha'ara in this Maharam Schick. And I think over the next few weeks, we'll continue into various name-related things. There's a lot of interesting shilas, like Ashkenazim and Sephardim naming after live people, not live people, husbands and wives fighting about who should name. Do the mother-in-laws deserve any say? Which names are okay? Shidduchim, Rabbi Chassid. We'll break down some of these shilas over the next weeks. This is just called like a hakdama to the sugya of names. Okay, to be continued.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.